There are almost 51 million people displaced internally across the world today. That's twice as many IDPs as there are refugees worldwide. And while the 20th of June marks World Refugee Day, there is no single day for internal displacement. Internally displaced people are the invisible majority of the world's displaced, and they need to be given more priority on the international political agenda. Our research shows that displacement doesn't start or stop at a border. In fact, there's a close relationship between people fleeing inside their countries and those seeking refuge abroad. What our research shows, in fact, is that many refugees, before crossing a border, were internally displaced. And many returning refugees are often returning back to conditions of insecurity that are putting them at risk of becoming further displaced and IDPs again.
Since 2018, we've interviewed around 1,500 IDPs, refugees and returning refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, Colombia, South Sudan, Myanmar, Yemen and Nigeria. And what we found is that cross-border movements are often a symptom of the failure to protect and assist IDPs in their country of origin. Around 57% of the refugees and returning refugees we spoke to had been internally displaced before seeking international protection, and they often experience multiple internal displacements before they crossed a border. For example, we spoke to a lady in Costa Rica who'd been internally displaced 4 times inside of Colombia because of continued persecution by a paramilitary group before eventually deciding to seek refuge abroad.
¿Por qué existe el desplazamiento transfronterizo en Colombia? Bueno, el conflicto armado interno colombiano es un conflicto prolongado que lleva más de 6 décadas. Esto ha implicado que millones de colombianos se vean obligados a desplazarse internamente, pero también miles de ellos han tenido que cruzar la frontera. Esto obedece a que es posible que no hayan encontrado dentro del territorio nacional un territorio donde puedan garantizar su seguridad y su integridad.
IDPs cross borders due to lack of safe environment within their country of origin. When they fail to get the living standard, good living standard in that particular area or the first area of displacement, they look for another area of displacement within the country, and this keeps on happening. But if they fail to find a place within the country of origin, that's when they then look for opportunities, or they seek for refuge in a neighboring country or any other country that they can easily access. But so in general, IDPs cross borders when they fail to get a peaceful or safe environment.
The most recent conflict in Iraq is a frame of reference. IDPs cross borders when they cannot find or access immediate safety and protection within their own country, often due to identity or perceived affiliations. Furthermore, many seek to cross borders over a broader concern of recurrence of events and violations that caused them to displace in the first place, from a pervasive sense that those who should protect them fail to do so once again. Overall fragility and instability cause others still to cross borders for the potential for greater opportunities and a sense of predictability than they find where they currently are. The reasons are many, but point to underlying historical governance deficits.
Fundamentally, why IDPs cross a border has to do with a lot of factors, but most especially this boils down to the worsening conditions back home that these IDPs go through. It's pretty difficult to say with certainty that this is when we expect the IDPs to cross border. That's not to say that you cannot make assessments or make projections and say this is when you expect the IDPs to cross border. The fundamental thing there is to understand that you're dealing with a messy process because crossing border is a messy process. There are a lot of nuances are involved, and some of these nuances are spontaneous. Some of the factors that make IDPs cross border. Some of them are quite spontaneous. It could be sudden violence, it could be sudden persecutions, it could be horrible things that just happen suddenly. And because these things happen suddenly, the IDPs cross the border sometimes much, much earlier than we would have anticipated.
Most of the world's displaced people remain inside their country of origin. At the moment, border closures linked to COVID-19 are obviously an important barrier to international protection. But even before the pandemic, people who wanted to seek refuge abroad weren't always able to do so. For some people, there was just no safe road out of the country, and for others, movement was just too expensive. Around half of the IDPs we spoke to said cost was a barrier to cross-border movement. And of course, after the financial losses incurred during the initial displacement, it can be very difficult for people to afford further onward travel. A Yemeni family we spoke to in Berlin spent $26,000 getting to Europe. And of course, this is simply unaffordable for many of the world's IDPs.
There are many barriers that limit cross-border movement. Some of these barriers deal with issue of landscape. Landscape in the sense that you're talking about topography, you're talking about terrible terrain that these IDPs have to go through across the border to new territories, and passing through some of the difficult terrains, whether it's in terms of crossing rivers, it's in terms of moving through very difficult mountains and all that. It's a horrible thing. Another barrier, another problem is in terms of language. Language can be a barrier, especially if you look at what is happening in West African region, where you have several languages, a lot of indigenous languages, and crossing border into another territory, once you don't understand these indigenous languages, can be a problem. So when people are trying to cross border into the new environment, into these other territories, language becomes a barrier.
Some of the barriers to cross-border movement for IDPs include insecurity, because they have to travel all the way from the area of displacement to the new or the country of refuge. But if the security is not all that good on the way, they are not able to travel. Another thing is cost of transport. You cannot travel, you cannot walk from the northern parts of South Sudan all the way to, let's say, an IDP may want to go to Uganda. So in that case, they may need transport, and in the process, they may have lost everything, including resources. So this becomes hard for IDPs to cross borders due to lack of transport or due to lack of resources.
Primary barriers for cross-border movement for IDPs in South Sudan are really based around financial access, insecurity, and physical barriers. But displaced populations can't necessarily be analyzed in South Sudan as a homogeneous group, but rather these barriers are going to impact populations much more based on their level of vulnerability than their status as an IDP in the first place. So households who have limited access to resources, low coping capacity, small social networks for that kind of support, or maybe single-headed, are going to be disproportionately impacted by these kinds of challenges or barriers preventing cross-border movement. On the financial access side, there are often high fees at border checkpoints along the road or at the border points themselves, and also transportation costs are quite high, especially in periods of crisis or conflict. Whereas households who are more vulnerable are going to have to rely on foot travel and can't necessarily pay or afford for these kinds of fees, whether it's at the border or for transportation. In terms of conflict, obviously in periods of conflict, mobility is quite restricted due to that either perception or anticipation of insecurity or the actual violence or conflict actively going itself. And this, of course, can limit a household's options on the direction or location they can move. If that insecurity is between the community and the border, then obviously that's going to pose as a much higher risk or barrier for that household to make that cross-border journey, especially for the households who are quite vulnerable and may not be able to access this through some sort of transportation.
Refugees return to their country of origin for different reasons. On the one hand, you have the positive pull factors like the presence of family, which is an important motivation for return. You also have negative pull factors like misperceptions of security in the country of origin, for example, especially after peace agreements, which may make refugees believe that the situation is sufficiently safe to enable return, even when conditions on the ground are sometimes more complex. And finally, you have negative push factors from the host country. The most blatantly obvious example is forcible returns, which unfortunately happen far too often from far too many host countries. But we also have different types of negative push factors, which could include insecurity in the host country. And for example, we interviewed some South Sudanese who had returned from Sudan as a result of the anti-government protests, which had made them feel unsafe. You also have refugees' inability to make ends meet in their host country, which can act as an important negative push factor. This can be the case in the context of an economic crisis, for example in Venezuela, but also if food rations or international assistance decreases in the host country, which has been the case in Thailand for refugees from Myanmar.
Por estudios hechos por la Unidad para las Víctimas del Gobierno de Colombia, encontramos que la mayor cantidad de retornos se dieron a partir del año 2016, cuando se firmó el acuerdo final para la consolidación de paz con el grupo guerrillero FARC-EP, lo cual generó una alta expectativa para colombianos que llevaban ya muchos años en búsqueda de protección internacional. Sin embargo, también encontramos que hay una añoranza por la patria y ese es uno de los motivos por los cuales también muchos colombianos retornan. Lo que hemos encontrado al contrario es que muchos colombianos que fueron desplazados internos y que se convirtieron en migrantes internacionales no tienen intención de retorno al no haber todavía en Colombia condiciones de seguridad que les garanticen una integridad de sus vidas.
Many refugees and displaced persons return to their home locations prematurely, often as a coping and a resilience mechanism. The situation in South Sudan today remains highly complex, with cross-border movement between Sudan, Ethiopia, the DRC and Kenya. DRC's protection analysis and engagement with populations in high areas of return show that while some report returning in search of prosperity and to see how the peace process is planning out, many also report a lack of basic opportunities, livelihoods, and increasing insecurity in their areas of asylum affecting their decision. Some people DRC engages with talk of a tough decision between remaining in a place with a lack of opportunity and increasing food insecurity versus a decision to return to areas which often lack basic services and see increasing violence and insecurity.
Some of the refugees may return to their country of origin prematurely due to a number of reasons. One can be, let's say, if the reason for their displacement ceases to exist. In South Sudan, after the revitalized peace agreement, some refugees have returned from some of the neighboring countries, although not all refugees. Another reason for premature return can be due to fear of arrest or deportation by the authorities of the host country. Thirdly, it can be that the living condition in the host country is no longer favorable to the refugees. Let's say the education system is not good, or the food ratio is not enough, or they don't have good relationship between the refugees and the host community.
We can see this from two perspectives. The first perspective is about in the new territory, or in the new country, or in the foreign country where these refugees are now. How have they been able to integrate in this foreign country? What is their condition like? Are they experiencing worse conditions? Are they treated in the most decent way? These factors can also make these refugees want to go back home. And again, this can also be as a result of what is happening back home. There could be marginal improvement of certain conditions that they had experienced that made them to leave home. There are some improvement, there are some gains back home. So this it could also attract them to prematurely leave the foreign countries and go back home.
Especially when refugees return prematurely to their country of origin, many go back to situations of internal displacement. Among all the returning refugees we interviewed, over 3/4 were not living in their area of origin at the time of the research. This was often a result of insecurity in their country of origin. For example, in South Sudan, we spoke to returning refugees living in protection of civilian sites because they didn't feel safe going back to their areas of origin. Property destruction is another important barrier to return. Among the returning refugees who had owned property prior to their displacement, 40% said that their homes had since been destroyed.
In order to understand why refugee returnees sometimes turn into IDPs when they come back into the country, it's helpful to look at the process through which most refugee returnees do actually come back. So oftentimes, refugees come back into the country to nearby locations where they technically are still displaced and not yet to their area of origin or area of former habitual residence, but are kind of checking out the situation to see if there is security in that area or if it's safe for the other household members that might still be across the border to return yet. In which case they kind of can be stuck in this situation of displacement in country where maybe conflict breaks back out or other circumstances happen that prevent them from returning for extended periods of time, and they're kind of stuck in this limbo. Another factor that causes refugee returnees to turn into IDPs is when they're actually moved or when they actually move back into South Sudan based on push factors in their area of displacement rather than pull factors into their area of origin. So for example, maybe high protection concerns or limited access to resources or food in the refugee camps where they've been living could cause populations to move back before they actually feel it's safe to return to their area of origin or where they would intend to return. And maybe they go back directly into a POC site or an IDP camp or a nearby area where family or social networks are that they could where they could be supported in periods of displacement, and then often, again, like I mentioned, are kind of stuck in this state of displacement in country, keeping them as IDP.
Fundamentally, for us to address durable solutions in terms of IDPs and refugees, is to first of all, one is to understand the very drivers of the factors that produce IDPs, the factors that produce refugees. Once we understand these fundamental factors, whether it's in terms of violence, it's in terms of persecutions, in terms of injustice, there are a lot of factors that lead to IDPs, that lead to refugees, people becoming refugees in foreign countries. So once we understand these factors and we're able to deal with these factors, we will be producing durable solutions to dealing with the question of IDPs and refugees.
To find durable solutions for people along the whole displacement trajectory, decision makers and service providers need to recognize the close relationship that exists between internal displacement and cross-border movement. It's clear from our research that we'll only prevent future refugee flows if we address the causes of internal displacement, which means investing in peace building and socioeconomic development in countries affected by conflict and violence. We also need to make sure that refugees' needs are taken into account and are met to prevent premature and unsustainable returns, which will only result in further displacement. And finally, since returning refugees and IDPs often face similar obstacles to durable solutions, we need a holistic response to address the vulnerabilities of communities affected by displacement, irrespective of their displacement status.